So thanks, Jenna, for the kind introduction. Today we're going to be talking about Composer, and I always like to teach. Before I teach a new tool, I like to kind of make the case for like, why do we need this tool? Is it just having a new tool for tooling's sake, or because someone told us it was cool, or whatever? So I really like to make the case for learning a new tool. And it's not just because I teach this stuff a lot, but for myself. Like, I need to be convinced that I should invest the time in this tool. So that's kind of what the first half of this presentation is going to be about. It's like, why do we need Composer? Why can't we do things the old way? And then the second half of the presentation, we're going to talk more about Drupal and about the Composer, the recommended Composer template for building Drupal sites, and why we should be using that, what that brings to the table. So hopefully the goal by the end of this little presentation is you have a better appreciation of why we should be using Composer and what it kind of brings to the table, and as well as what the recommended project Composer template for Drupal brings to the table. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my video. And as Jenna said, I like questions, so feel free to put stuff in the chat, and Jenna will be keeping an eye on that, and I will. I've got an eyeball on it right there as well. So let's get rolling. So first of all, this is me. I'm Ultimike on Drupal.org and a lot of other places online. I've been a web developer for a while, and a Drupal developer for not as long, but still a considerable amount of time. One of the things I'm known for is the Drupal Career Online Training Program. It's a 12-week program, and I think I see at least 2 of our graduates in the list of participants, Terry and Amy June. So welcome to both of you. And Greg as well. And Greg has acted as a mentor in our program as well. I think Amy June's actually acted as a mentor as well. So Amy June's been doing double duty for us. But it is a 12-week Drupal training program. It's roughly 2 half days a week of classroom training or virtual classroom training, as well as a bunch of office hours and a bunch of other kind of add-ons to get you more integrated in the Drupal community and expand your Drupal network. We kind of think of it as holistic Drupal training, and we've had really good results for the past 11 years that we've been doing it. And our next semester starts August 29th, I believe. Every time I say that date, I feel like I'm off by a day, but it's the end of August. You can go to this link right here, DrupalEasy.com/DCO, and you can get all the information there. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about Composer. Why do we care about Composer? Why do we care about dependency managers in general? And that's what Composer is. It's a dependency manager. So let's take one step even further back and figure out what is a dependency manager. What do we care about that for? So what we're going to do for the next few minutes is maybe have a little thought experiment. We're going to forget about Drupal in the short term here, and we're just going to talk about making an application, a PHP application. Knowing that we live in an open source world, especially if you do Drupal, a lot of Drupal is open source, and use a lot of open source code, but let's kind of dig into that a little bit. Let's imagine that we're building out just a generic PHP project called My Project. And 2 of the crucial features of this project are going to be the ability to send fancy looking emails, maybe HTML formatted emails with attachments, and also the ability to read and write YAML files. Now, we could absolutely 100% write all of the code to achieve both of these goals by ourselves. We could crack open php.net and learn about file get contents and learn about all the PHP mail functions and all that stuff, and do all of this stuff just by writing a whole bunch of code ourselves. That's definitely one way to go. The other way to go is embracing the fact that we live in an open source world and go out and find some PHP classes. We often also call them libraries or dependencies or PHP components. All those nouns are kind of, for the context of what we're talking about, kind of the same. But we could go out and find some PHP libraries that help us with those tasks, that make it easier to send HTML formatted emails, or make it easier to read and write YAML files. And two of those components are listed here in this little box, something like Swift Mailer, or something like the YAML component, which is a Symfony component. We could absolutely find that stuff online, most likely on GitHub, possibly on GitLab or Bitbucket or other kind of Git-based repositories out there. And we could download the latest version of Swift Mailer, download the latest version of YAML component, and write the glue code in our module to call those components and have everything kind of work. And on the day of release, of our project, version 1 of our project, we can be confident that our project is currently working with whatever version of Swift Mailer we downloaded and whatever version of the YAML component we downloaded. And everything's great and happy and everything's working. But what's important here is to know that every single PHP library, the maintainers of those libraries or components, whatever you want to call them, they are not aware of our schedule for our project, for releases for our project, nor should they care. So maybe there's like a security issue in Swift Mailer that is going to be fixed in 5.4.13. We need to be able to easily update our project to the newest version of Swift Mailer. But there's a lot we don't know there. We don't know, if the next version of Swift Mailer is going to change some APIs that we're calling. We don't know if there's going to be security fixing feature that in the future that we need. We don't know, the next major version of Swift Mailer that can change a lot of things. So we kind of have to make sure that when we are deploying, oops, I went back one too many. When we are deploying version 1 of our project, that we are confident that which particular version of Swift Mailer and which particular version of YAML component is working. The last thing we want to do is kind of deploy my project version 1.0 and send that along with the latest version of Swift Mailer, maybe version 6, where things actually don't work out. So what we want to be able to do is we want two things. We want to be able to use the latest version of our dependencies so that we get bug fixes, security updates, performance gains, and all that fun stuff. But we also want to be able to lock. We also want to be able to say that version 1 of our project works with this version of Swift Mailer, this version of YAML component, and this version of whatever other components we might have. So the ability to keep things up to date and the ability to lock versions to whatever release we have, knowing that things work. That's already sounding a little bit tedious. It actually gets much worse though, because all of these PHP libraries can have their own dependencies. So just like our project has 2 dependencies, Swift Mailer could have its own dependencies with all of the same problems, or let's call them challenges. All of the same challenges I just mentioned is, being, this version of Swift Mailer works with this version of Email Validator, but maybe it doesn't work with version 2.2 for some reason. So we have to make sure that when we build our project, we know exactly which version of not only our main dependencies, our direct dependencies, but also our indirect dependencies as well. So even with 2 components, this can start getting a little bit hairy. And once you start really growing the number of dependencies that you have, it starts getting a lot more complex. Now, at this point, you might be saying to yourself, okay, well, maybe it's easier just to write all this code ourselves. Well, it might be if we didn't have a good tool. So you kind of see where I'm going with this, obviously. So let's kind of summarize where we're at so far. When we build our project, version 1 of our project, and we start using dependencies, we can be confident because we've tested it, we built it, that it will work with particular versions of the dependencies. But there's no guarantee that the next version of a dependency is going to work with our project. And as I mentioned, we should be able to lock, either, in some process or just in instructions, like deployment instructions, say, when you're deploying version 1, make sure you use this version of this dependency, this version of that dependency, and so on and so forth. Another potential problem that we might see is, well, what if 2 of our direct dependencies have their own dependencies on the same dependency, but different versions of that dependency, right? So let's say 2 months ago when we were building this project, we added SwiftMailer 5.4.12. And that had a dependency on this polyfill icon v dependency version 1. And everything was working fine. 2 months later, we're still in development for my project, and we realize, oh, we need some other dependency. And that some other dependency requires a newer version of polyfill icon v. What do? Number one, we have to hope that we remember what we did 2 months ago in getting the version 1 of polyfill icon v, so that we actually have a shot at solving this. Or we could just blindly download the other version, the version 2 of the 2.3.2, and replace the other one, the version 1 version, and suddenly our SwiftMailer stuff isn't working anymore and things break. So we need some way of checking to make sure we're not having conflicting versions of dependencies. And again, with just a couple of direct dependencies, this problem is already seeming pretty darn tedious. So again, summarizing, we could have dependencies of dependencies that conflict with dependencies of another dependency. If I could fit the word dependency in that first sentence, again, I would, because I think it's fun. And this problem only gets worse. It only gets worse for modern content management systems, say like Drupal. Drupal Core, just Drupal Core, has well over 100 dependencies. Nobody wants to manage that. Nobody wants to do this stuff manually and figure out all of those versions that need to be used, make sure there's no conflicts. And believe it or not, the value of using all of these dependencies far outweighs the work involved to make sure everything goes smoothly. And that is because we have a tool like Composer that basically does it for us. So keeping the versions locked, as well as checking for conflicts, challenging at best. Assembling the code base, that includes dependencies and subdependencies, and making sure version numbers work and no conflicts is, again, tedious at best. Ryan Zrama, one of the leads of Commerce Guys, he was giving a presentation a few years ago now about something, and he was talking about Composer. And he basically said, the reason we use Composer is because we can't count on ourselves. We're not dependable to do this task. That's why we need this tool. And really, that's what Composer does for us. We basically tell Composer, hey, Composer, we need a new dependency. Sometimes we tell it we need a particular version. Often we just say, give us the latest version that works for us. And it takes care of the rest. It goes out usually to Packagist, sometimes to Drupal.org, sometimes to other repositories, and it basically says, hey, what's the latest version of this particular dependency that you have? Tell me about it, tell me what its subdependencies are, and I'm going to check and make sure that it's not going to conflict with anything else in Mike's project. If everything's cool, I'm going to download it, I'm going to download all of its dependencies, and I'm going to put it in a predictable place in the code base. And by predictable place in the code base, I know my camera's off, but I'm using air quotes around that phrase. That predictable place in the code base basically means so it can be auto-loaded, so that it can be used when called upon and not always sitting in memory when it doesn't need to be. So Composer does all of this stuff for us. And it basically creates a giant manifest for our project. And if you've used Composer, you've probably heard that word before. When I talk about the Composer manifest, I'm talking about the composer.json and composer.lock file combined. it creates that manifest and maintains that manifest, and that manifest basically is a list of all of the installed dependencies, the exact versions that are installed. So that the next time we go to either update a dependency or add a new one, Composer can turn the crank and make sure that by updating or adding a new one, nothing breaks. Because honestly, without Composer, we would not be, Drupal 8 or Drupal 9 would not be what it is today. And many PHP-based projects would not be able to exist in their current form without one of these dependency managers. Most coding ecosystems have dependency managers. If you do any JavaScript stuff, NPM. If you've ever seen a package.json file, and usually in the Drupal ecosystem, it's usually in the front end world, but that's a package manager for JavaScript stuff, just like Composer is a package manager for PHP stuff. So I think anyone who's using Composer, if you're new to Composer, if you've been using Composer, this is kind of a key element of, I know for me, once I kind of went through this exercise and really understood what problem it was solving, this unlocked a lot in my brain for like, why do we care about Composer? Like you, I'm sure everyone here has either known someone or themselves had the urge to, why can't I just go to Drupal.org, download the module, extract it, and put it in my site's modules contrib directory. Now it's modules contrib directory, and just go on. Why do I have to use Composer require to get it? Well, the reason is all of this stuff. There's a lot of Drupal modules these days that have dependencies, and only by adding them with Composer require can you get those dependencies in a way that guarantees they're not going to conflict with other dependencies. They're going to end up in the right place. They're easy to update with the Composer update command. So hopefully by now, it's been a good 5 years, at least 6 years since Drupal 8 came out. It's been a bit of a long road to get the community comfortable with Composer, and I think this is kind of one of those. It's kind of an entry-level tool for building Drupal sites these days. You kind of have to know Composer. So hopefully, if there's any gray area with why we're using Composer, those few slides cleared it up. So if there's any questions, I'm open to questions, and I actually do want to see the results of the poll real quick. Jenna, how can I, oh, thank you. Okay, look at that. It just popped up. I can get
you can
that.
see
Okay,
them.
so
Perfect.
Yep, I see them now. Fantastic. All right, so a couple folks new to Composer, a few more folks use them but don't always understand what they're doing. So hopefully for you, those 5 folks, hopefully I was able to illuminate some of your brain light bulbs there. I'm looking for the last one, for the Composer expert. I'm please, if there's mistakes or if I said something wrong, absolutely call me on it. You can call me on it in the public chat. I'm absolutely a good sport when it comes to that. I use Composer daily and understand most of what I'm doing. That's 5 people. So that's great as well. My goal is for me to teach you a nugget here or there in the next, in the last 20 minutes, in the next 20 minutes or so. Hopefully I can teach you 1 or 2 things you haven't known before with Composer. So great, we got a great mix. That's good to see. Okay, so I don't see any questions in the chat. What do you think, Jenna? Should I just keep moving forward?
Yeah, go on ahead and I will stop you if I see any questions that come in.
Fantastic. All right. So next stop is I want to talk about the Drupal recommended project template. This is something that started, it was released alongside Drupal 8.8. So this is not something that we had with the launch of Drupal 8. There's actually an unofficial Composer project template between Drupal 8 and Drupal 8.8. But since 8.8, we now have an official one. This is actually part of Drupal Core, along with a couple of plugins, which we're going to talk about. But again, I like to make the case for why do we have to use this template, or why should we use this template? Why can't we just go to Drupal.org, download, Drupal Core, which you could still do. You can go to Drupal.org, go to the Drupal Core project page, and there's a tar.gz file or a .zip file. You can still download it and start a project that way. I really don't recommend it. And we're going to, hopefully, I'll illustrate the reasons why I don't recommend that in this next section. So, to really utilize and maximize the use of this Composer template, you kind of have to understand what a Composer template is and like what's the point. So rather than diving in and looking at this template first, we're actually going to pretend that it doesn't exist and try to stand up a fresh Drupal site without the template, and talk about the tasks or the things that we're going to have to do in order to make that happen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to my command line, and hopefully that's big enough. I'll make it a little bit bigger. I'm going to make a new app directory, and I'm going to cd into that app directory. And nothing up my sleeves. Empty directory, obviously, it's brand new. I do have Composer installed here, 235. Maybe there's a slightly later version. This is from April, so it's about a month old, but this is pretty good. You should absolutely be using Composer 2 at this point. If you're not, there's really no downside and there's only upside. Its performance is lights out compared with version 1. So if you have not updated to Composer 2 yet, you should absolutely do that. All right, so we're going to create a new project, a new Composer project. And the reason we're going to do this is because we want to be able to use Composer to add dependencies to our project. The first dependency we're going to add is Drupal Core. But much like when you're starting a new project, you have to initialize a Git repository with git init. When you're starting a new project without a template, you can initialize a new Composer project with Composer init. And it's going to ask you some questions. So package name, so we can say, DrupalEasy /atin. So this could kind of be like, not kind of, this is vendor name. Description, we can write out a sentence here, cool project. Author, we're not going to put any authors in. Minimum stability, I'm going to list this as stable. So what does this mean? Is you'll see minimum stability in virtually all of your projects, especially if you're using the Drupal recommended project template. The minimum stability configuration basically says when a Composer update or a Composer require command is run, what is the version that you want to default to? So by setting it to stable, we're basically saying, get me the latest stable version that meets my version constraints. So if we were to change this to beta, this would basically allow us to do a Composer required Drupal /path auto, for example. And if there was a beta version of the path auto module that's newer than the latest release, we'd end up with the beta version. So generally, you want to leave this at stable. It doesn't block you from getting dev or alpha releases or beta releases or release candidates, but it does force you to ask for them specifically. So minimum stability stable is a good place to be. And since we are kind of building out a website, we're kind of the end user, so to speak. Again, I'm using air quotes, you can't see me. So we're going to build a Composer project as opposed to a library, which is a dependency, or a meta package, which is like a bucket of dependencies, or a Composer plugin, which is akin to a Drupal module, right? Where a Drupal module extends the functionality of Drupal. The Composer plugin extends the functionality of Composer, and we're going to talk about a few of those in a moment. We'll skip the license. We're not going to define any dependencies yet, or we're not going to define the auto loading. And we're going to go ahead and confirm generation. And all we get out of that is basically composer.json, oops, with that. Oops, somehow my, let me see. I had a little sidecar with my notes going here. Let me just open that back up. What happened there? Give me 1 second to. Okay. Everybody can still hear me, right? We're still here?
Yes.
Okay, very good. All right. So with those questions, so not a whole lot of excitement going on there, but we now have a quote unquote Composer project. So now let's add Drupal Core. So traditionally, if you're building a PHP project and you need to start adding dependencies, you're going to go to packages.com or .org, I'm sorry. And you can search for Drupal/core and you're going to find Drupal Core recommended. This is actually the recommended dependency for Drupal Core that you can add to fresh projects. This is the dependency that the default template uses that we'll see in a moment. And basically what this is Drupal Core along with all of the, and notice, exact versions of all of the dependencies that Drupal Core needs. So, if we go back to, this, imagine this is Drupal Core and exact dependencies. So we know that, here, I'm gonna click on 9.3.13, sorry. I went to the wrong one, sorry. 9.3.13 there. We know that Drupal Core 9.3.13 requires the exact versions, and it's guaranteed to work with the exact versions of all these dependencies. So let's go ahead and we're going to go ahead and get this dependency. We're going to get Drupal Core, so I'm going to copy that. And I'm going to come back here, and I'm just going to do a Composer will require Drupal Core recommended. So while this is running, and this will take a moment or two to run, because there's a lot of files to download and stuff like that. But what we're going to see at the end is we're going to kind of be seeing the default behavior of Composer. And the default behavior of Composer is to download all dependencies to the vendor directory. All right, so now that that's done, if I do an ls-al, we now have a vendor directory. And if we look in that vendor directory, we now have a bunch of directories, including a Drupal directory. I'm looking for Drupal Core here. So if I go into Drupal, there we go. There's Drupal Core. And if we look in that, we kind of see what we're looking for, right? This mostly looks like Drupal. If you go to like a Drupal Core directory on any of your files, but what we don't see here is like, there's no index.php file here. So we're going to come back to that in a second. But so we have Drupal Core, but we have it kind of in this odd little location of vendor/Drupal/core. If we want to really build out a best practice focused Drupal site, we would want Drupal to be served from a nested doc root, right? So we would basically, what we would want here, we have our project directory. We would want a web directory. Some people call it doc root. Some people call it, it's kind of an old school one, but public HTML. Some people call it www. I'm gonna stick with web. But ideally, we want the document root to be this, meaning when you set up your virtual host, you want www.mysite.com pointing to the web directory. The way Composer does it by default, it's going to have to point it to, something like this directory, which is less than ideal. So we're kind of seeing our first problem, right? Our first problem is when we use Composer, generic Composer out of the box, we end up with Drupal Core in the wrong place, to put it very flatly. We don't want Drupal Core in the vendor directory. We want Drupal Core in the web directory. So that's a task. We would have to figure out some way to either manually do that, which wouldn't be too bad. That's moving some directories around. Or we'd have to write a script, maybe like a bash script or something, that after Composer does its thing, then we move Drupal core to the right location. And none of it's super difficult to do, but it's just work we would have to do. Luckily, there is a Composer plugin that can help us with that. And it's a, it's a very well-used plugin. It's called Composer Installers. And what this plugin does, remember, it's a Composer plugin. It extends the functionality of Composer. What this Composer plugin does is it basically allows us to put specific dependencies in specific locations. So again, by default, Composer is going to put all dependencies in here. We could do a Composer require, Composer, spell it right, oh man, Composer /installers. So we could require this to our project, and it's going to ask if we trust it, we do. And then we would have to, I got some weird error there, but I'm going to ignore that. But then we'd have to configure it. We would basically have to learn how to configure Composer installers so that when it sees Drupal core, it doesn't put that dependency in the vendor directory, it puts it in the web directory. So there's still some work, to do. We get some help with the plugin, but there's still some work to do. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is the one I alluded to, is, let me just go back to show it. If this is Drupal core, where is the index.php file? Right? Where's our robots.txt file? So with Drupal core, there's a bunch of files that actually, in a default, Drupal installation, they don't actually live in the core directory. They're part of Drupal core, but they actually live outside of Drupal core. So I'll just show real quick. If we go to, and I'm just going to, this is the DrupalEasy.com code base. So here is the core directory. It's already been moved. It's in the web directory, just as we talked about. But look at all these other files. These are all, example that get ignored. Index.php. Here's that robots. All these are all, what we call scaffolding files. These are all core. This is part of Drupal core that doesn't live in the core directory. So we still have to find those or create those. Like, how do we have to put them in the right place, which ultimately is going to be our web directory. Well, if you've ever had a chance to poke around Drupal core, there is an assets directory, and then a scaffolding, and then a files directory. This is all inside Drupal core. If we look inside there, look at that. There's all of our scaffolding files. Now, some of these, like index.php, go in the doc root. Some of these, I think, like this one, these linting ones, I think these actually are meant to go in the project root. So again, we would have to, if we didn't, if we were doing this manually the way we're doing this, we need to figure out some way to move these files, copy these files from this deep, dark location to the web directory. Again, we could do this manually. Nobody wants to do that. Or we could write a script to do it. But again, that would be work we would have to do. All right, so two big things we would have to do manually. Number one, we'd have to put dependencies in the right place, like Drupal core. Number two, we'd have to move these scaffolding files around manually. Number three problem, if we do a Composer require Drupal /path auto, we want to add another dependency in the form of Drupal module. We're going to end up with, we're going to see one issue, but it's also going to have a second issue. So the issue we're going to see here is it can't find it. Composer doesn't know what the heck we're talking about. Why is that? Well, if we go back to packages, it's not found. So remember what packages is. Packages is the default location where Composer looks for dependencies. The default location, default being the key word there. So when you do a Composer require, that's where Composer is going to look. If that dependency, if that vendor name is not on packages, it's not going to find it by default. So how do we fix this? Well, there's actually quite an easy way to fix it. Composer is super expandable in multiple vectors. One of the ways it's expandable is you can tell Composer to look other places as well. You can say, hey, Composer, in addition to checking packages for Drupal/path auto, you can check this other location over there. And for Drupal, that other location is literally a Drupal.org packages type of site. It's a site maintained by the Drupal community that exposes every single one of the non-sandboxed modules, themes that appear on Drupal.org. So again, this is another task we'd have to do. Number one, we'd have to have that knowledge. We'd have to go find the details about this mysterious Drupal packages instance. We'd have to look up how to add that to our composer.json file. And again, once you do it, it's actually quite easy, but it's still something you have to do. The other problem, if we had that solved, the other problem is that this dependency is going to end up in the vendor directory, just like Drupal Core did. And we don't want modules in the vendor directory. Modules belong in the web/modules, ideally /contrib directory. So this goes back to the Composer installers program problem, where we want core to go in one place, contributed modules to go in another place, contributed themes to go in another place. So these are all like they're not major hurdles. These are all things that can be solved with research, with maybe a bash script, with other potential solutions, but it's still work that even if we solve it once, the next time we spin up a new Drupal site, we're going to have to copy that stuff in and all that stuff, and that becomes tedious. So hopefully by now I've made the case. This is where a template would come in. Wouldn't it be great if there was a project template that if we started with that template, it solves all of these problems for us automatically? Well, that's exactly what the Drupal recommended project template is. It is a project template to start a fresh Drupal project that solves those three issues, as well as a couple other minor ones. It Composer installers and all the configuration. So it puts core in the right place, it puts modules in the right place, it puts themes in the right place. It includes a scaffolding plugin. Remember, a Composer scaffolding plugin. And that scaffolding plugin sees that anytime Drupal core is updated or added, it goes and grabs those scaffolding files from that deep dark vendor directory I showed you, and it copies them to the right place. The really cool thing about that plugin is what it does by default in this template is the absolute minimum of what that plugin is capable of. It's a really powerful plugin that you can utilize to customize scaffolding files, remove scaffolding files, all kinds of cool stuff. And then the number 3 thing it does out of the box is it includes that little snippet that tells Composer to also look for Drupal modules or Drupal projects, on Drupal.org. So it is a best practice for managing a Drupal 9 project code base. You don't actually have to use the Drupal recommended project template to get all the same benefits. I know a lot of agencies and a lot of organizations that have their own version of this template. Those of you that are familiar with Pantheon, when you start a new Drupal 9 integrated Composer project on Pantheon, you're not using this template, but you're using a template that looks mysteriously similar to this template, along with some Pantheon special sauce. So this is a good place to start for most folks, but if you have an agency and you know that you want to always use additional plugins or always want to have additional modules, by default, you can kind of create your own plugin and still get all of the same, create your own template and get all of the same advantages. So there's a link here to the official documentation. And like I said, if you're new to Drupal, this is the recommended starting point, even if you're not new to Drupal. If you just want to spin up a quick site under local, this is the recommended starting point. So by default, kind of a review of what I just said, it makes Drupal core a dependency of the project, puts everything in a nested doc root, web by default, although you can change that if you want. The super robust scaffolding plugin, it puts all of the Drupal specific dependencies in the right place via Composer installers. It adds that little snippet to get to Drupal's public Composer project repository. And one caveat, it does not include Drush or Drupal console or Composer patches by default. You would have to add those separately, but that's a very fast Composer require line. So let's take a look at it real quick. Where are we on time? Oh, just about up. So I'm going to head over here to GitHub and we'll just take a quick gander at it. And then I will open the floor to questions. So I'm going to go to the latest version, go to the composer.json. I'll make this a bit bigger. So if you recall with our sad little project, right? So we kind of started with just this stuff. And then we had a little require section. As we required core and installers added that. This is kind of the template version. So we've got a bunch of metadata up here. It's recommended that once you use the template, obviously take ownership of it. You know, you can change the name, the vendor name, change the description. You know, you can get rid of this stuff. You can add authors, change the license, stuff like that. Here is the little snippet that tells Composer to also check the Drupal.org Composer packages. So again, once you know it, it's a 10-second copy and paste, but you don't really ever need to do that. Here are the 4 dependencies we get for free or by default. Composer installers we've talked about. The core Composer scaffolding plugin we've talked about. There's core recommended, that's the one that we were playing with. And then we also get this core project message. And to be honest, this is, you know, normally whenever I use this template, the first thing I do is remove this dependency. All this dependency does is after you spin up a new project or after you use this template, it just spits out this message on the command line. So it's really geared towards folks brand new to Drupal. It's like, hey, you've installed Drupal. Here's where you should go next. That's all it does. So I would recommend, you know, after you use the template, do a Composer remove on this, and then you can actually go in and just delete all of this stuff as well. I like to keep my Composer, the JSON file, as lean as possible. What else do we have here? Okay, so there was an old Drupal core dependency called Drupal. No one should be using it, so they just, you know, the template says never use it. Here's that minimum stability stuff I talked about. Some other minor configurations. I'm not going to spend any time on that. This is for the core Composer scaffolding plugin. This basically tells us what the doc root is. It's /web. So if you want to build a site and use, you know, www as your doc root, or literally docroot, the string doc root as your doc root, you can change that stuff here. You'd have to do that before you run this template fully. So we can talk about that if someone's interested in that in the last few minutes. And then all of this stuff down here, this is all of that Composer installers config that I was talking about. So this basically says, should Composer come across a dependency that is listed as a type Drupal core, that will go in the web core directory. If it finds a dependency, or if really what it's saying is, if a dependency is requested of type Drupal module, it won't end up in the vendor directory, it will end up in this directory. So again, none of this is that difficult, but we kind of get it all for free with a Composer template. So when we tell Composer to start a project with this template, this just runs and we end up with a solid Drupal, I should say a solid best practice focused Drupal code base. That is an excellent starting point.